morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much. So before you get some of the finest minds in gambling, you get me talking about growth, regulation, and consolidation. And for those of you who've heard me or Regulus speak before, you'll be pleased to know that I've already had 2 minutes shaved off my time. So we've got 16 minutes. I'll try to keep it to 10 and open up to Q&A on any of the points that we've raised or anything else that you'd like to ask about in the morning. And then I'll be around later for any of those questions you don't want to pose in public to the audience. So first of all, just check my mic's still on. Can you still hear me all right? Yes. Good stuff. So first of all, one of the most important changes that have occurred probably from 2018, but certainly moving into 2019, is that the main growth engines of online gambling of the recent past, all the way back to UEFA, have stalled. It was consistent and reliable that Nordic countries and the UK especially would be growing at 15 to 25%, depending on the comps in the year, depending on the product mix. They're big markets, they're liquid markets, and even with a tidal wave of regulatory change occurring, that growth allowed the industry largely to flourish. That growth's largely gone now, partly because of the law of big numbers. There's already been a large mass market adoption, and there's already been a lot of channel shift, but also because, as you'll all be acutely aware, a lot of regulatory actions in the UK and elsewhere that have squeezed growth in 2018 and 2019. Now, looking forward to 2020 on that point, we think that 2020 might actually be a bit of a better year. We've got the Euros. Some of the VIP and regulatory comps of some of the biggest operators are quite soft. And so even getting back to where those operators were in key markets like the UK and Sweden should make 2020 look all right. And there's a great example there of 888 had 50% growth in its UK casino division in the first half of this year, which got the entire group all the way back to where it was in 2014. But that's what 50% growth can do in a challenging market environment. So we think that the growth that we saw in northern markets, northern European markets, that was largely driven by really strong underpins of increasing mass market adoption, increasing connectivity, greater use of smartphones for transacting, payment methods becoming more readily available, cheaper, data costs coming down. All of those things are still very much the case and intact in southern, central, eastern Europe, also emerging markets, not the US on connectivity, but certainly in terms of opening up. So we think that growth is going to continue all around Northern Europe. The problem with that is that it is a much more fragmented form of growth than we've seen hitherto. If you just need to get the UK and Nordics right, it's much easier than getting 20 different countries right, all with different languages, payment methods, regulations, etc. So while the growth is still there, first of all, it's coming from a lower base, and second, it is fragmenting the market further, and also creating more and more barriers to success and more opportunities to fail. Even in the US, we would suggest that we've had a really attractive period of New Jersey opening and proving that mobile is the key for growth. And then we've got Pennsylvania following that, which is sort of given this year in the bank and next year in terms of the comps and the sequencing of those two growth. I think then we're going to start running into the issue that not very many states in the US look like New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and we're going to start noticing just how much it costs to get that kind of growth in those markets. So I think even the US, people, as soon as they start looking at regulatory momentum and start looking at the bottom line, it will be a difficult story to sustain. So 2020 slightly easier comps, but an increasing headwinds in terms of underlying challenges almost everywhere, and I should warn you now, it doesn't get any more cheerful than that. So in terms of regulation, we think there's been a real shift in regimes that have historically wanted to be liberal and are also point of consumption. And it's super helpful that here in Malta there's an understanding much more of the operator and the sort of point of supply drivers. It's great when a government and a regulator gets that. The problem is when the government and the regulator is where the customer is, they don't have to and often don't want to. So we've seen a swathe of countries, name a country almost, there's been a level of negative regulatory or fiscal or political intervention. And that is making it harder, we think, for countries that are going to regulate or looking at their regulations afresh, like the UK, which every party now has promised pretty much a new gambling act in some form, is going to do it on the liberal basis that we've come to expect from UK, Denmark, Sweden, Romania, etc. So the shift of regulation to protecting the customer, usually for good reasons, often with good results, but also often with unintended consequences because politicians haven't fully thought through the problems and create solutions that sound good. Also, frankly, because the operators have a habit of saying there's nothing to see here, and then it gets exposed, and then when they say, oh, but it's very complicated and you need to listen to our very thoughtful ideas on how to fix this, the politician's already said, I don't trust you, I don't even like you, my constituency doesn't like you, so I'm going to do as I please. And we're seeing that more and more. So while there is a lot of hope in the US, for example, in Brazil, we think that the reality, when it meets the kind of regulations that are going to be put into position rather than the kind of regulations that we hope for, is going to make life really challenging for a lot of operators. Like Brazil, for example, if it does only allow betting, then I can think of 1 or 2 operators that will benefit, and I can think of about 25 that will lose. And yet Brazil is nearly always presented as an opportunity. We don't think it is for the vast majority of gaming-driven operators. Also, one of the things that we think we're going to see from a sort of geopolitical standpoint, and we're already seeing the noises coming through, is China really not liking online gambling. China hasn't liked gambling, even its own regulated gambling, for quite some time. But the sheer scale of unregulated land-based gambling, largely through agents in China, has meant that the disruption that we've seen in those agent networks, which leads to the arrest of hundreds and sometimes thousands of people, millions and sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars seized, doesn't tend to get people noticing because it doesn't disrupt the online environment that we tend to focus on. But we're seeing huge channel shift in Asian markets away from land-based points of payment principally to direct online. Chinese government's noticed that, doesn't like it, is already putting a huge amount of pressure on the Philippines. This is a level of pressure that China can exert pretty much globally. And if you ask any politician anywhere in the world, what do you like more, online gambling or China, it's a really easy choice for them to make. So we think that geopolitical tension around China is going to keep bubbling up and going to have some really interesting implications for our industry that we probably haven't really thought through yet. And then finally on M&A, and then we'll have 5 minutes of Q&A, or if you prefer, we can just wrap up and get back onto timing. We've seen a bunch of big deals. Everyone's hoping for, expecting for mega deals, and we've got another big deal ready in Stars and Flutter. We've had a whole bunch of bolt-on deals as well, and some interesting supplier deals. Now, our concern about the consolidation environment that we're seeing is that it's largely driven by growth pressures in core markets, and it's driven by cost pressures, principally in core markets, and also the cost of opening new markets. So a great way to solve that is to combine businesses together and take out a load of cost. Now, that's great. It stacks up from a business point of view, it stacks up strategically, and we're not suggesting that it doesn't, but what it doesn't do is create an environment that's more interesting for the customer. What we want to see is a consolidation market or an R&D market which actually focuses on product development, on actually changing the dynamics of what the customer is seeing, rather than the customer getting the same old set of brands on a smaller operating base, because that's not going to drive growth. And I think that the crisis in growth that we're seeing in Northern Europe because of regulatory interventions, I mean, just look at Kenya, will percolate through to emerging markets as well, meaning that unless the industry can get its act together with a really clear social responsibility message that genuinely works, that wider society can buy into, and also innovates around making the mass market customer more interested in gambling than they are now, then we'll probably look back at the last 10 years or so as the glory days of online gambling that we won't see again. So our message for 2020 is beware the soft comps providing a little bit of relief in terms of making it look like growth is a little bit better, because the number of problems and the number of critical points of failure in the industry that are building up are such that we think we are entering into a much more challenging period to operate successfully. And there probably needs to be a strategic realignment around the customer, around getting a buy-in from politicians that this is an acceptable activity, and as well as running businesses more efficiently. So I said I'd go quickly, and I have. So that's what we've got to say about 2019 and what we think is going to come up the horizon in 2020. Are there any questions from the audience at this stage? I think there is a roaming mic somewhere. Always a good sign. Well, I'm around later if there's just abuse that you'd rather shout instead of asking questions. Thank you so much for your time.